Welcome to the latest edition of Access All Areas with Dermot and Felicity. I'm My Way Access, Dermot Deflin, and with me always is the chronically fabulous Felicity McKee.
You're too kind, Dermot. We're so glad to have everybody back again this week, and we were very pleased to see the reaction to the podcast last week. I think it was a really good start to what we're hoping to do, and we hope you stay with us. This week we are going to be exploring the purple pound and the finances of being a disabled person and what that entails.
So, Felicity, we've been looking through so many news items this week that we feel it might be a good idea to discuss with our listeners. Is there anything that's caught your eye that you feel would be a good thing to talk about?
So I think for me personally, just as someone who is shielding, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme is one that has been really interesting, if only because it's not something that you can access to take away. So you have to literally dine in the venue to access this. And I was noticing that there's a national food scheme, and they get, I think, £15, which is expected to cover the meals, say for a child or for a person for an entire week. And yet this scheme is able to provide £10, up to £10 for individuals who are able to dine out. And as a disabled person who's shielding, I can't dine out. And I cannot access this scheme. It doesn't have an element for that. It is encouraging me to go out into a venue where I'm having to rely on other people, social distancing and adhering to guidelines. And that is quite concerning. And it's one of the small and perhaps you could argue subtle ways in which at times it feels like the government has forgotten people who are shielding and has forgotten disabled people more generally. This is something that if they are hoping that could help the economy and especially local businesses and things like this, that they should have thought about all the people who may have wanted to access this. And the fact that you have to dine in is quite limiting, unfortunately.
I totally agree, because I've been sort of following the story for quite a while, and it does seem to have an element of ableism about it. Maybe not a conscious level, but it just sort of empathises when it comes to disabled people who seem to drop down to the bottom of the pecking order again when it comes to thinking about the services that are available for us, including all sorts of schemes now with COVID, because, in the past, it wasn't financially possible, finances weren't available to provide the budget to help sort of people in poverty, which a large number of disabled people are. Yet now that this 50% is available for anybody that comes into town with no registration, no identification, no sort of thing for him to fill out. You just walk in, order what you want, and walk out again. And I just think that there just seems to be something a little unjust there. I don't know how you feel about that yourself, Felicity.
I think it's kind of ironic in the fact that so many people have been furloughed or struggling with finances anyway, and even with the discount of up to £10, it isn't something that is accessible to everyone. So it's not a simple case of me just saying that this system and scheme is inaccessible to many disabled people, especially those who are shielding, and even with shielding coming to an end, those who wish to, or well, basically in my case, will most likely remain shielding, because obviously we haven't got to an area where things are as they used to be. But there's still families in poverty for whom this scheme isn't accessible even then. And it just seems really ironic that the government can provide £10 or up to £10 for these big businesses, and not provide support for other people, especially those who are in poverty. So, a lot of food banks have been raising the issue of the fact that they have seen a rise in their use because of lockdown and because of furlough. And there's actually a campaign in which people can pass on their 50% discount in restaurants to help fight food poverty, and it's sort of encouraging people to actually donate when they go out and do that. It's via the Big Issue and other organizations, but it's literally just, I think, the fact that clearly there is money there. As we're going to be discussing later in this podcast, there are so many disabled people in poverty, and just so many people in poverty generally. It makes you wonder sometimes just where the priorities of the government are.
Oh, I can totally understand, because you raised an interesting point there in the last wee bit there. You were talking about the food bank, especially since COVID, that the numbers have risen significantly. But this figures have sort of been growing for the last 5 or 6 years. Politicians and whatnot saying that the number of food banks is actually a good side of the economy, that these are there, that people want to help. But they're using that as a get-out clause to actually provide help and support for people that actually need it, who are in poverty. So it's kind of a smack in the face now that when it's people that are, for want of a better expression, maybe not in poverty, who are non-disabled, who don't come from a poverty background or been affected by it, then certainly the finances is available.
Yeah, so like, for example, the government is going to spend 500 million on the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, and yet when it came to the campaign to fund free school meals over the summer holidays, that was only going to cost 120 million, and they had to be shamed into making a U-turn to agree to that. And that's a lot less money, and that's helping directly people in poverty. It's just quite drastic when you look at the actual costs, and the fact that this money does exist, and that poverty doesn't necessarily need to be there because the government does have this money. And yeah, and also from the perspective of people who are already struggling, with poverty and with food poverty specifically, and struggling to buy and afford food, the campaign as well when it comes to obesity is also very difficult, because obesity does tend to affect people who are in lower socioeconomic backgrounds because they cannot afford the so-called healthier food or the fresh food. As a disabled person myself, I can't always have fresh food in the house because I'm not well enough to prepare it or have the energy to manage that. Like, if I was to buy it, one, it's more expensive, and two, it would probably go off before I got time to actually make it into something that I could eat. And so it does mean I have to rely more on like ready meals and pre-made food. A lot of the campaigning, such as the anti-obesity campaigning and the Eat Out to Help Out, seems to be ignoring wider socioeconomic issues.
Some of the other news I was looking at this week is across the UK, this is Shop Local Week, where it's encouraging people in the local community to get back out into town, and now the shielding has been lifted, and to go to the local groceries, go to the local cafes, go to the local bars and restaurants, try to promote, try to get the local economy stimulated again, because they've had a tough time. But I feel that it's not quite right yet, because a lot of our towns are maybe just not quite equipped yet for disabled visitors coming in to their local shop, because they're bringing in a lot of new schemes now, as you say, because of COVID and social distancing. A lot of these shops now are bringing some of the retail out onto the streets, particularly cafes and restaurants, where they're bringing tables and chairs out. And I've seen evidence as well, admittedly through Facebook and Instagram, where people are bringing sofas out onto the streets. And worse than that, they're actually taking up disabled parking bays. So if a disabled person feels that they're comfortable enough to come out and maybe mix a little bit, maybe at a reduced social distance, but albeit a social distance all the same, then their parking space has been taken away from them.
That's definitely something that I've seen, especially when it comes to like people creating queues in the front of like supermarkets. And again, my experience of this has been online as I've been shielding, but I've seen photographs of disabled bays being used to extend queues and just similar issues to that. And it's the fact that it feels very much like we are an afterthought, because if you think about it, there are far more non-disabled parking bays than there are disabled parking bays, and there's not enough disabled parking bays to begin with for the amount of disabled people there actually are.
Yes, you say that. I mean, you're saying that we're an afterthought, but in some cases we're not even a thought. And I think that this is why it's important that, especially in this new climate, they say, when they're bringing in these new social distancing rules, that they can bring out street furniture onto spaces, public spaces, that disabled people need to be involved in the conversation, because ultimately we're going to be the ones that are affected the most. And we're not just talking maybe people that are physically disabled, but then you have sort of other issues as well, you know, whether it's learning disabilities or mental health disabilities, where they don't feel maybe as safe, you know, serving and navigating so many people, especially when they're invading what they believe is their comfortable route.
Yeah, I think people don't really take into account with this. And so, as you said, with the sofas and stuff like this, that's something that I've also seen as well online. I know that you have previously run a campaign to highlight the fact that people do tend to park in the drop-down curbs and other areas and blocking footpaths. And when people block a footpath, they're, you know, it shouldn't be that I have to argue, well, actually, that could be detrimental to a non-disabled person. So, for example, a person who happens to be pushing a pram may not be able to get past the tables or the sofa, but it's an issue for people who have mobility aids, who are in a wheelchair, people who are visually impaired, to try and have to navigate around that. It's also a social distancing issue as well. And it just creates all these unnecessary obstacles which don't need to be there. A lot of the time I find that sometimes it's sad, but sometimes I have to say, well, this is an issue for a non-disabled person as well before it gets taken seriously.
Yeah.
And that's just really depressing because we are people too.
So I think that really covers everything in the local news now. So what we'll do now, we'll take a little break and we will head over for our main discussion this week, the Purple Pound disabled finances. So we'll see you after this short break.
The main theme of this week's podcast is obviously the Purple Pound and the finances of disabled people, and sort of discussion in and around that, which you may have picked up on our initial discussion about shopping local and other things at the start of the podcast. Dermot is a slight expert, in my opinion, on issues of the Purple Pound. Would you like to introduce it to our listeners?
Well, the Purple Pound is coined from the phrase that the colour for disabled people and disabled issues across the Western world and is purple, although admittedly in the US it is blue. So when we talk about the Purple Pound, we're talking about the disabled spending pound or power. Now, what a lot of our listeners will probably be aware of who are disabled, but maybe the non-disabled listeners would be surprising to find out that in the UK and Irish population, the disabled people make up 1/5 of the population. That's 19.5%, which is quite high. So, and this is one of the things I would often tell businesses when I'm talking to them. We make up 1/5 of the population, and you could be denying us or custom in your business. So, as I say, if you're starting a brand new business tomorrow and you're writing a business plan, you're not going to put a big black mark or big red mark to 1/5 of the potential customers you might get. And by not having your premises accessible for disabled people, you are by fact doing that, cutting off potentially 1/5 of your revenue coming in that day, that week, that year. Now, a lot of businesses might argue that it's not possible to make some sort of alterations, and to agree that that might be possible in sort of some extreme cases when it comes to sort of landmark buildings and stuff like that there. But it doesn't neglect them of responsibility, because there are sort of ways around it that people can get. For example, they can get portable ramps and stuff like that. But in some cases, I wouldn't even go as far as saying that because of landmark buildings that it can't be done, because I've been to Belfast City Hall on a number of occasions. Felicity, have you ever been yourself?
Yeah, no, I've been to City Hall as well, and I've been there when they've had the Continental Market and other events. And landmark buildings or historic buildings can be made accessible. Now, some people have argued that it would ruin the aesthetic of the building, but I'm not really sure what the point of the building is if you're opening it to the public and 1/5 of the public can't necessarily access the building. As you said, I mean, this is bad business practice, but also at a fundamental level, it is just basic discrimination.
Well, as you were saying, that some people might say that it could ruin the aesthetics of the building. But the reason I brought up Belfast City Hall, I've been in it one time for an event with the Disability Action NA, and me and my friend decided that I had to go to use the toilet facility. We were just walking up the corridors, and we seen these big heavy doors. And I thought, how am I going to get these doors open? And they looked like they were doors that had been there when the building was built. But as soon as I was on several feet of them, the doors automatically opened up without the press of a button, without me pushing. And there was me thinking that this door, which was, because of what it did, would have been there maybe at the very most 5 or 6 years. But looks wise, it looked like it belonged there since the building was built. And then I stopped one of the staff and I said, listen, I need to use the toilet. Where is the toilet facility? And they said, oh, it's downstairs, the business corridor, which I hadn't been down. And I said, well, where's the lift? I said, well, that's up just in front of you. And I seen this really classy looking little, made of glass, and it looked like it belonged there since the beginning, just like the door. And what that actually was an elevator. So it just goes to show you that, they might say that it's going to ruin the aesthetic of buildings, but it won't. Belfast City Hall, we were able to get the finances to make it possible to do this. And this is why I say Belfast City Hall got the finances, and I think it's an onus on the local government and the wider government to help and support, particularly the smaller businesses who, maybe find it harder to make the adaptation for disabled people, that they're able to step in and provide support. People might look and go, well, sure, why don't I have no money to these businesses, just so you can stick a ramp on or widen the door. But at least back into, if we make it accessible, disabled people can go in, we can start spending our money, buy our groceries in the shop. We can go to the local music store and get our vinyl records or MP3s or whatever it might be. Things to do. We're able to get in and get these things in the local shop, and we're not forced to do this online. How do you feel about that yourself, Felicity?
So like as you were saying in regards to accessibility and maybe financial aid to assist businesses with that, there is the Sunflower Lanyard Scheme, which is for hidden disabilities, and it's quite accessible to most businesses to either get lanyards that they can hand out to customers, or simple training and posters so that their workers, say in retail, are aware of what that symbol means and are then disability aware, so that shop itself then is accessible in a different way. Because we have talked an awful lot about ramps and other things, but again, disability is so much wider than just, say, physical disability. And so when people do say, oh, but it's so expensive, I couldn't possibly, there are ways people can start on the journey towards making their business more accessible that are a lot more financially achievable, maybe in the short term, because quite literally you can download a poster and information from the Hidden Disabilities website. Like with the Ewan's Guide, they have the red cord cards, which are, you can give a donation if you're a business to access them. There's small ways that you can bring in information on accessibility to your business that are cost effective and will also encourage and allow more disabled customers to then come in and then partake in your business. So, I mean, it makes financial sense.
Well, the same I can understand. In fact, one of the local things that's been set up in recent years, which has proved to be very successful, is the jam card. And what they do is they offer a card, so when people with disabilities or maybe have a confidence problem or a communication problem that they might need an extra few seconds, that they can display this card at the shops or wherever it might be, just to give us a few moments just to gather their thoughts or to help them through the process. But as well as that, the jam will actually come into these shops that want them and train up the staff on how that whenever they do meet somebody that has a jam card, what's the right way and what's the right training, what they need to be aware of. So as you say, the people with disabilities do maybe, non-disabled might a lot on physical disabilities, and even within the physical disabilities, they might just focus solely on wheelchair users. But as you quite rightly say that disability is a wide umbrella, and there's a whole lot of different branches, which is all equally as important as each other, and should all have the same focus and the same sort of help and determinations and schemes and sort of help behind them to help them get in the shops and train. In fact, even the jam card has been adopted in recent years by TransLink, so that whenever people are getting into the local trains or local buses, all the bus drivers are well equipped and trained to understand and how to react and how to behave in such specific incidents. And if there's any to see where people display the cards and maybe having sort of difficulties and you know, in the circumstances that the bus drivers and train drivers are able to understand what's going on and able to provide a service and a help, makes them feel more relaxed and makes the place feel more inclusive, and they can get in the train and buses in peace.
Yeah, and jam card is something that's over in the UK as a whole. So like I have seen it when I've been on the trains. So I've taken very long train journeys in the UK, and the jam card is recognised. So I remember getting off at a station and they had a specific quiet room set aside for disabled customers, and they did advertise the jam card in there, and they recognised the jam card, and the room was amazing. I cannot speak more highly for this room. I think it was with Virgin Trains, but they had sensory elements and just other elements, but also you were able to keep track of when the trains were coming, so you wouldn't miss your train, and there was other support there, and you could, if you needed to talk to someone and get maybe assistance, there was a button you could press if you needed for that. It was a great room overall. So like there are small things I think businesses can do to make the premises more accessible, but also to make their business and the atmosphere just generally a lot more friendly to disabled customers. So like it's one of the things that I noticed when I went to Waterstones in Belfast, and I don't think this has changed, but if you need to go upstairs in Waterstones in Belfast, you have to go into a separate building to take the lift because they don't have a lift in their building. You have to talk to a member of staff who then takes you into basically through a separate business beside them to get to a lift. And you know, they do have an option, but if you don't ask, you don't know that that option exists, because when I first went into Waterstones, I didn't think I could get up the stairs. I didn't think there was an option.
It's funny you say that. Somebody actually sent me a picture this morning uh, of a lift was in a shop outside. So I've been premises, we have to go up a step to actually get in. So some of these shops would provide a lift so that you can get into the premises. But this particular shop had a sign to say that to operate the lift, come up the steps and ask the member of staff to come out and help you. I was just thinking, what was that about? And I know it's a laughable point, but it's sort of emphasizing, as you said earlier, Felicity, it's all well and good having the facilities there and having the equipment there and accessibility there, but the staff need to be trained as well and what's going on. And that's just blatantly what happens when you don't train somebody about the lift. Keep it on so it can be used. Don't ask a wheelchair user who can't get out of the wheelchair and go up steps to get out of the wheelchair and go up steps and ask, can you get the lift on so I can go back downstairs and get in the lift to come back up again?
Yeah, because I would be an ambulator, a wheelchair user, but I don't always have, a mobility aid with me, like a wee small one folded up at the back of the wheelchair to then hop out to try and get someone. But like that reminds me of Starbucks near the Europa in Belfast as well. They have a wee button outside the door which you can push to alert the barista that there is someone there who needs a ramp to get into the premises. But the problem is you then have to hope that someone has noticed that you've hit the button and also is available to come out. And I remember I was out with friends and I was in the wheelchair and we couldn't get into Starbucks. And it got to the point where people ended up helping lift the chair into Starbucks because we had waited so long and people were coming past back and forth and wondering why we were just sort of waiting at the door. So some of these systems, I think they're well intentioned, but sometimes how they're implemented doesn't work. And it's important when you see a system like that not working to think, how can I make this work better? Because in that case, Starbucks nearly lost not just the custom of me as the disabled person, but that of all my friends who are with me.
Yeah. That's exactly the case. But that's why, as I say, training needs to be a part of the accessibility as well. Because without that, they're going to end up losing potentially 20% of the potential custom, and not only 20%, but as you say, the knock-on effect of their friends who are with them, who will decide, well, I'm not going to give them the custom anymore because of how bad they were treated or how bad the access was, which you've seen yourself and I've witnessed too. So for a business to survive, especially now when we're living in this new world with COVID, people are sort of a bit scared to go out and a bit scared to go shopping unless it's essential. that you need to make it inclusive and accessible, but so potentially that everybody comes, and that includes disabled people, so they can get out and safe. But Felicity, you know yourself, we are 20%, we are the purple pound. But as you know, like when it comes to the purple pound, it's not a strong pound because of the finances that we're in. So maybe that might be something that we could expand on as well.
Yeah, so obviously we are 20% of the population, and we do have a huge influence when it comes to the economy with the purple pound. But I think one of the things people don't realize is the actual cost of being disabled. So Scope did a report, and it's called the Disability Price Tag. I think it's really eye-opening. I personally was unfortunately not surprised by some of their findings, but I do know that, for someone maybe who hasn't seen the report or isn't aware, some of the statistics and some of the information they find out can be quite shocking. So, for example, disabled people on average are facing extra costs of up to £583 a month. They're basically the equivalent to almost half of a disabled person's income. This is not including their housing costs. 1 in 5 disabled people are facing extra costs of up to £1,000 a month. And what I think was really interesting was the fact that on average, £100 for a non-disabled person was the equivalent to just £68 for a disabled person. And this isn't just disabled people that are being impacted by this. Like, families with disabled children are facing extra costs of £581 a month, almost a quarter, so that's 24% of families with disabled children have extra costs that amount to over £1,000 a month. And, as we were talking about when it came to like issues of poverty and disability, there are huge rates of poverty within the disabled community. And, PIP and other benefits and things like this aren't necessarily helping with that, because it can be so difficult to even access that. So New Policy Institute has found disabled people have the higher poverty rates than the rest of the population generally, that the poverty rates they're understated by the official statistics that we get, that disabled people are making up 28% of people in poverty, and that a further 20% of people in poverty are living in households with a disabled person. So when you look at that as a whole, we make up nearly 50% of households that are in poverty within the UK. And that's a scandal in and of itself, but it's really, it could be completely avoided, because when we look at the government, as we were talking about with the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, there are people living in poverty who that money could help, and they didn't want to do the free school meals, they had to be shamed into it, but they suddenly have £500 million to spend on the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, where there's families who couldn't even afford to eat out in the first place, especially families with disabled people.
That's absolutely scandalous. I mean, pretty much I agree with you said at the very beginning. I'm actually surprised to hear just how widespread it is. It's not totally unexpected, because myself as a disabled person, I do recognise, the extra money that I have to spend because of my disability. So it's not a total surprise. We do have an extra financial burden or an extra financial restrictions placed upon us.
Yeah, it's one of the things that, as a disabled person who gets PIP, I find it quite upsetting when people sort of seem to assume that PIP is some sort of freebie that I'm getting, when actually it's going towards all these additional expenses that I face. So for example, I currently have a manual wheelchair. I struggle with my manual wheelchair because I lack some upper body strength. I would really love an electric wheelchair. I cannot afford an electric wheelchair. Even if I could afford an electric wheelchair, I then cannot afford a vehicle in which the electric wheelchair can go into. And if I spend the Motability part of my PIP specifically on getting a car, when it comes round to renewal with the government, there's no guarantee that my PIP will be continued. I could lose my car, and I could lose then basically my independence. There's a lot of these factors involved when making decisions. My mobility part goes towards the running of my car, even though my car is not ideal. And my hope is that it can go to getting an add-on onto my manual wheelchair that would actually make it electric, but would mean that it's still technically manual. So what I'm thinking about is it's literally a little clip-on thing that goes onto the back. It has a little motor into it, and it weighs about 14 pounds. So the actual wheelchair itself, which is a lightweight one, plus the motor, would still be lighter and probably, well, cheaper in the long run for me, because I wouldn't necessarily need to get a new car, but it would still then mean that I could have an electric chair. But these are the additional expenses. So I think I was talking to someone recently who was buying a new vehicle, and their vehicle was from 2012. So it was a wheelchair accessible vehicle, and it was about 33,000. That's secondhand. That wasn't new. That's a second-hand vehicle.
I had in the past looked into getting an accessible vehicle for myself, because I still have an ambition at 40 years old that I want to drive. For me to get would be, as you say, second hand, and because of the type of wheelchair I have, that I would have to get a van, and which would be a transit van. Again, it could be upward to maybe 35,000 to, in some cases, 50,000 pounds. But I still have to make sort of decide to me what's more important. So I, like at the very beginning, I valued my independence. What was going to bring me my independence more? Having my own vehicle, or having my own place, my own house to live in, which I have now. I decided to go for that. I've been living in my own place now for 11 years, but this is a house from the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. So technically it's not my own place, my own house, but because of the way disabled finances is, it's what I'm able to get. But it meant I had to give up my ambition of being a driver. But I have been sort of reignited over recent years about wanting to be a driver again. But I've got to the stage now with meetings and everything that my hearing isn't equipped for that anymore. So I had to make a decision: do I want to be a driver, or do I want to hear people around me? Because I can't afford to do both of them. So I've now opted for to get new units that are not from the NHS, because the NHS units are not equipped for my needs. So that's just one example of the finance restrictions that disabled people meet. But as you say, plus there's a whole lot more that are property related.
Yeah, so like for example, I mean, my manual wheelchair, which I have, it was secondhand. It was £300 secondhand, which is really good because it's a lightweight active user wheelchair. Because brand new, it could be up to £2,000. And that's a manual. That's not an electric wheelchair. That's manual. The thing is, when people look up wheelchairs, sometimes they'll see stuff online. They go, well, you could have got one that was like £100. But that one is one that I need someone else to be with to push me around in. It's probably not the best suited to my needs, because like what I would really need personally is a wheelchair that's more suited to me and more fitted to me. This is a wheelchair that I got to test and to try out and to see if it worked, and it was the best that I could afford at that point. But there's so many people who are having to fundraise and do GoFundMes to get wheelchairs and to get other mobility aids, and that's the real scandal, because even with PIP and with support and things like this, obviously, as the disability price tag report from Scope shows, there's huge additional expenses that people are facing. So like with taxis, for example, many taxis, they're not supposed to, but many do. If you need a wheelchair accessible taxi, they will charge you twice the fare that they would have charged. So if you phone for a taxi, and the taxi you get happens to be a wheelchair taxi, you do not have to pay more than what you would pay just your average fare. But if you specifically phone and ask for a wheelchair taxi, they will then charge you double, because it is a wheelchair taxi and it's more specialist. And it's just like these little hidden costs that people don't consider. So when I'm too unwell to get to the hospital myself, for me to get from university halls to hospital is £20 one way in a taxi. It costs me about 50 quid in total to go to hospital and back if I'm sick.
That's sort of leads in as well, because I don't know what it's like with yourself in Swansea, but here in the Fermanagh district area where I belong to, the public transport system is not equipped for disabled people like myself. That there's just not enough wheelchair-friendly buses or disabled-friendly buses in the area. So if I wanted to make a journey, then I would have to pre-book at least 24 hours in advance. Or in some cases, if I wanted to make the journey to, say, Dublin, I would have to pre-book with TransLink 2 weeks in advance.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've noticed when I've come home, especially because I would fly in and out of Dublin Airport, and TransLink and being disabled can sometimes be quite difficult. So Dublin Airport, they used to drop off at both terminals. They now only drop off at one terminal, even if you're flying out of the other terminal, which has meant that there's many times when I have shown up and the disability support services have been very confused as to why I'm in that terminal. It's been very difficult to then try and navigate my way to the other terminal and has left me quite unwell and physically pained. They could drop off at the other terminals because other buses do. And I've had discussions with staff in the airport and they don't understand why TransLink don't, because other bus companies can. I believe TransLink told me at one point that there was the risk that they might face fines, but then the other companies are facing fines too and can drop off their disabled customers there. So I don't know what's going on, but just my history of being a disabled customer with TransLink has been very hit and miss.
That's what sort of leads back into the extra financial restrictions that disabled people have, because presumably when you go there and you have to go to the other terminal, you probably have to pay for a taxi or some service to take you over. Pretty much like myself, I had actually last summer I went to Derry to meet a friend of mine during the summer, and I got the bus up and that was no problem. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to get the bus back, due to certain circumstances. Now, it meant then that I couldn't, like, say, a non-disabled person, wait for the next bus.
Yeah.
There was no bus available for me. So I was then forced to make the 40-minute journey, which would have cost, I think wouldn't even be £10 on a bus to make. I was forced to get a taxi, which ended up costing me £90.
See, like it's things like this that people just don't understand because they're not experiencing it themselves. And there are no words to describe just how scandalous that is. And, in the case of TransLink with that, TransLink should be ashamed for the fact that they do not have suitable services for disabled people, and the fact that you were facing those additional costs that are completely avoidable if they had made their service accessible. The thing is, I think I've reached a point where I'm not necessarily surprised, but I'm just perpetually disappointed by businesses and some society at times. It can be really exhausting facing this repeatedly.
Well, the good thing anyway regarding TransLink, is they work with an organisation called Impact, Inclusive Mobility and Transport Advisory Committee. So that's made up of people with various types of disabilities, and they meet regularly with TransLink to highlight issues and to advise them on sort of future plans to make sure that it is accessible for people with all kinds of disabilities. Again, it's something that's it's still a work in progress that I'm involved on, but I have seen sort of some positive reactions, but it's like yourself, it's very slow reaction, and it's something that you sort of have to keep working away on.
Yeah.
It does make you angry that the disabled people have to get involved in these organisations and have to actively lobby so these issues, financial restrictions are removed, because of accessibility issues, etc.
Yeah, because for me, £90, well, basically that's my entire PIP benefit pretty much up in smoke. If I had to get that taxi, that is a lot of money. See, I feel like TransLink should really have a scheme in place that if they cannot provide a suitable alternative for you to get your journey home, they will cover the cost, say for like that taxi.
But Felicity, I think we've covered all on the main topic today, unless there's anything you wanted to round off before we move on with the rest of the podcast.
I think the one thing I would want people to take away from this is just a greater appreciation of the hidden costs of being disabled. I know the scope report can be quite shocking and quite jarring for some people who don't have the lived experience of facing these additional costs, but just it's food for thought, and it would be nice if maybe some people listening heard that, then explored ways in which they could become activists to challenge this, maybe even asking TransLink to create that fund so that people don't have to pay out for a taxi.
I would definitely give you the Felicity, because the greater people that have appreciation or a little insight or understanding what we in the disabled community go through, because unfortunately the perception is we're getting free money for nothing, and unfortunately that's just not the case.
Well, I mean, if someone wanted to live with my chronic pain in return for the benefits, I might swap. They can try it for a day and see if it's worth it, because I don't think it's worth it.
I'll have to get out my quantum leap accelerator and let them have a go. So with that, I think that covers now for the main talking points. So we're going to take a little break and we'll just come back for a little roundup of our lives and what's happening. So we'll see you on the other side. And welcome back. That was a great discussion we had earlier on there, Felicity. So now I think just before we leave now in the next 10 or 15 minutes, we'll just find out what's going on each other's lives. I believe I was reading on the other night that the university you belong to, Swansea University, one of their campuses, Bay Campus, caught on fire. Is that right? And
No, so I in off-campus accommodation. So thankfully, it didn't impact me directly. It has impacted some of my friends' work and are mainly based on Bay Campus because the building that caught on fire was the engineering building. So Bay Campus is an extension of Swansea University that was recently built. It cost about 450 million. Building itself, 3 floors have been destroyed by the fire, and there was millions of pounds worth of equipment in there. So like it is quite devastating when you consider the fact that the university was opening up again in September, and we have students coming back who were hoping to use these facilities, obviously with social distancing in place because it's going to be a mix of face-to-face teaching and online. But just generally, it's a huge loss to the university, and I'm not really sure what's going to happen there. It's one of those things that you don't expect it to happen. It was quite sudden. It happened about 6 o'clock in the evening, and the smoke from the fire could be seen all over Swansea.
a big fire, and not obviously, done such a huge financial damage to the building and stuff like that. But the fact that it was seen all over the city, it just gives you a visual impact of just how devastating it was, not just to obviously Swansea University, but to the Swansea itself.
Yeah, well, thankfully there was no staff or students in the building, so obviously nobody's been hurt, and I think that's the only saving grace in this entire situation. But it is a huge impact to the university, and I no words to describe the sorrow I feel for other students whose research has been destroyed or has been impacted by this fire, especially the fact that sometimes they've left their offices during the lockdown and there's equipment or other things there. So like I left my space on the other campus during lockdown, and if something was to happen, there is stuff there that I wasn't able to take with me at the time, that if something was to happen like this would be absolutely devastating to my work. So like it's been a difficult week as a Swansea University student, and I think it's been a difficult week for anybody associated with the university because of this. But I mean, looking forward, the university is very positive about social distancing measures and students coming back in September. There has been a bit of fun in regards to university mishap. I was in a Zoom call in which myself and the other person had a third person, which neither of us knew, but we each thought the other person knew them. But my week has mostly been filled with awkwardness and fires, but I do believe yours has been filled with lots of fun news about Doctor Who and Christopher Eccleston, one of your favourite topics.
Well, Felicity, anybody that knows me, they just have knows three things I like to talk about. Just about the quantum leap and Doctor Who. And
you're not wrong.
This was a big week for Doctor Who. The only thing was that I just found out the news just as we dropped last week's episode, so I couldn't talk about them. But I was just on Twitter and I stumbled across the Big Funny Twitter feed. I don't know if you're familiar with Big Funny.
I'm sort of familiar, but I think I'm more familiar through you because I see all your retweets and shares on Facebook. So I'm living vicariously my Doctor Who life through you.
Well, people that aren't familiar, Big Funny is one of the licenses, and actually the most popular one is Doctor Who. It was actually the first license that they could offer them. And what they've done is they've brought back old doctors from the classic Doctor Who series, breathed new life into them. Popular doctors in Doctor Who history is actually Paul McGann. And you might look at me first and go, well, she's only ever in one TV movie, an 8-minute mini episode. How is he one of the most popular ones, or one of the most revered ones? And that's actually all through the audiobook, through Big Funny, because they were able to flesh out his character and breathe new life and give him brand new stories and companions. In fact, one of the sneaky things that Stephen Moffat did as part of the 50-year anniversary of Doctor Who 7 years ago was they dropped a little line into Paul McGann mini episode, which made all the audio dramas within Big Funny for Doctor Who canon, which was really exciting. Recently what they've done, they brought licenses to be able to bring back old doctors from new Doctor Who, being the War Doctor in the Time War. But one of the people we thought we would never get was Christopher Eccleston, because people with Doctor Who will be familiar. Christopher Eccleston and Doctor Who BBC had a big falling out during the production of his first series, and that ended up not only being his first series, but being his only series. It's only in recent interviews over the last number of years where he started talking about Doctor Who again, issuing that he loved the series. He just had a lot of issues with the BBC Wales, as it's called, BBC Studios now, particularly the Doctor Who department, and that's why he never returned, or he never showed any interest. But he was actually been able to talk them to going to Doctor Who convention in America in February called Gallifrey One. Christopher Eccleston was over there, and he got chatting to one of the CEOs of Big Finish and said, would you be interested? After 15 years, Christopher Eccleston is returning as the Doctor in March 2021. 12 new.
I love a good audiobook. I can't wait to see what you're going to say up on Facebook when this comes out and how this will expand the universe, because I know how excited you are now, but you'll be like a kid at Christmas when they actually come out. And 12 episodes, that's a lot. That's like half a season of an actual TV series. That's a lot.
Well, in fact, Christopher and his Doctor Who run 13 episodes on TV, and now he's going to do 12 episodes on audiobook, so they probably end up getting another contract to do another maybe 4 to 5 or 6 or even more. So he could actually be in the same way as Paul McGann. But I must tell you a very funny story. My story was Christopher Eccleston. Several years ago, I was up in Belfast with a friend, and we went to see a play, and I got up the next morning and my friend went downstairs to get a breakfast, and I said I'd short like, so I was coming down the lift and walked this man, and he had a big smile on his face, and I looked at him and this man looks very familiar, and I looked at him and I said, are you who I think you are? And he went, yes I am. And I said, I can't believe I'm in the lift with the former Doctor, Christopher Eccleston. And his face sank, and I go, what's wrong? He says, I'm not Christopher Eccleston. And I said, well, who are you? He says, I'm the former Liverpool manager, Brendan Rodgers. That's my Christopher Eccleston story.
Oh, wow. I think like the closest I would have is like I accidentally bumped into Jamie Dornan in Belfast once, but it was one of those split-second things where like I think he was like trying to go somewhere like sort of incognito, and he smashed into me in my coffee. I was very apologetic, but was in a rush, and I never got another coffee. Well, if I ever see him again, he probably doesn't even remember, but I want a coffee. I want my coffee back.
Well, if I was you, I would demand it. Well, it sounds like we both had eventful weeks. Happy New Year too. But just before we head off now, maybe we just have a wee review of what we spoke about tonight.
Yeah, so I think some of the key takeaways from tonight, from my perspective, would be that if people are looking more information about the disability price tag report, that they can find it on the Scope website. So Scope is a charitable organisation for disabled people, and they also provide other services, and it would definitely be worth having a look at. It's a very beautifully laid out report as well, so visually it's great. So it's very accessible, I find, from that perspective. It's not very daunting when you go to have a look at it. But I think that would be one of the main things, that people get informed, get educated, and then maybe consider how they can take that forward to bring about change.
Definitely, and just to follow on from that, what I'd like people to take away is, when they go back out onto the streets again, back into the shops, maybe having a pint of beer in the street or having a sandwich out in the disabled parking bay, it's just think for a few moments, like, who am I obstruction, or who am I causing difficulties around me? Because it could be a person coming along in a wheelchair, or a person that can't just see quite as well as you or I, going to be having difficulties because of the tables and seats, and something that we're all very familiar with, signage on footpaths and roads. It's just so, whenever you're going to put these tables out, just take 1 or 2 minutes and think, who am I restricting by allowing somebody else comfort?
Yeah, it only takes 2 seconds. Just, if that's all people take away, is just that they have a moment to think, that's definitely a start on the road to making their business and their lives generally much more accessible for other disabled people.
Well, we've come now to the end of the podcast, so I just wanted to thank everybody for listening. If you've any sort of comments on what we spoke about today, just drop it a wee line on either Facebook or Twitter. You can find me on Facebook and Twitter at MyWayAccess. And Felicity, if people want to contact you, where are you?
So I'm at @ChronFab on Twitter, but you can find Chronically Fabulous on Facebook as well. But you can also find me personally at McKee_Felicity on Twitter if you just want to send links my way or feedback on the podcast, or generally just for a wee chit chat about all things disability or even geek related. I do like a good conversation.
Then a good conversation my way too, especially if it involves Doctor Who or Quantum Leap. So, but as I say, if there's anything you want to discuss either next week or in the following weeks, get involved in conversation with either Felicity and I. We will get that conversation started onto the podcast. So until next week, good luck for me, and I will stay safe and look after yourself. Thanks for listening.
Oh yeah, well, was it stay safe, stay socially distanced, and we'll see you next week.